Hello everyone, welcome back to Clockwork Kitchen, where I teach you all the things that you need to know to feel more comfortable in your kitchen. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Nicole. Today we're going to talk more about knives. This is part 2 of my series on knives. If you haven't watched the first one where I talked about what kind of knives you actually need to own, go back and watch that. I'm going to link that up here somewhere. In this video, we're going to focus on how to use those knives. I'm going out of town soon and I have a bunch of things to prep before then. And I'm going to link all the recipes down below in case you want to try them out as well. But I'm going to show you what I'm making, and along the way, I'm going to teach you how to hold your knife, some of the most basic cutting instructions that you're going to see in recipes, and what on earth this thing is, because I realized I forgot to cover it in my last video. The phrase I want you to keep in mind for this entire video is go slowly. If you've never really used a knife before, if you're not all that comfortable using a knife, and even if you're just like, I got this, go slowly. There is no need to move at rapid speed in order to make good tasting food, and I really don't want anyone to get hurt. Okay? Let's get into it. A lot of knife sets come with this rod, and if yours didn't, I would recommend getting one because it's actually a really useful tool. This is called a honing rod, and a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that it's a sharpening tool, but there's actually a really big difference between honing and sharpening. To explain the difference between sharpening and honing, I'm going to use my hands to show you. It's a little exaggerated, but go with it. So imagine that this is the blade of your knife, right? Now, a dull blade is going to look like this. And in order to sharpen it, you're going to shave off little bits of steel in order to reform the blade and have it go from here to here. So that's sharpening. But in your everyday use with your knife will get a little bit warped because it's steel, and steel can bend a little bit. So throughout your everyday use, your knife is going to start to kind of lean like this. And again, this is exaggerated, but it's going to look kind of like this. You might not even see it with your naked eye, but your knife is kind of warping a little bit. So for your honer, you're basically reforming the knife so that it goes from here to here. If you're interested in a video about sharpening, let me know in the comments down below. It's actually a pretty in-depth topic, and to be honest, I don't handle the sharpening of our knives, Ike does. And if you're just like, nope, way too intense for me, not interested in that, that's fine too. A lot of kitchen supply stores or even hardware stores will offer sharpening knives as a service. So I did like a quick Yelp search for the DC area and found a bunch of options. So take a look for your area. It's totally easy to outsource that. Okay, back to honing. You should hone your chef's knife pretty regularly. I recommend at least once a week, but I've definitely gone through periods where I've honed it before every single use. It's something where if you do it right, you can really notice the difference in your cutting abilities right away. To hone your knife, hold your rod at a 45-degree angle. Make sure that you're holding your rod behind this little barrier. If you put your hands over the barrier, you will most likely cut yourself, so keep it behind there. Take your knife and put the part of the blade that's closest to the handle against the part of the rod that's closest to your hand. Some people do move from top to bottom. I prefer to move from bottom to top. It just feels a little less terrifying that way. And then slide your knife in a diagonal pattern so that the tip of your blade touches the tip of your honing rod. You do want to make sure that when you put the blade on the rod that you aren't slamming it down, then you might dull it, and that is completely counterintuitive to what we're trying to do. The other thing to keep in mind is that you are trying to hone the edge, not your entire blade. So you are not trying to lay it flat against the rod, you're trying to lay it at a bit of an angle so that the top of your knife isn't even touching the rod. After you do one side, you move your knife behind the rod and make the same movement again. So just re-angle your blade facing up so that the edge is touching the honing rod and slide again in a diagonal. Keep doing this maybe 5 times per side and your knife is honed. Remember to go slowly. You will probably see a lot of people who do this super quickly, but again, you do not need to move quickly in order to properly hone your knife. Take your time, go slowly. I move slowly. I'm terrified of moving at that crazy speed because then I just can barely tell where my knife is. So take your time and go slowly. You can hone a paring knife as well, although you don't need to do it quite as frequently. And I've also seen videos and explainers online that talk about how to hone your serrated bread knife, but to be honest, I've never found this to be totally useful. If your serrated bread knife is not cutting things properly, or if there's just a problem, it might be that it needs some sort of sharpening, or that just something else is going on with it besides needing a hone. All right, now that your knife is honed, let's talk about how to hold it. When you're cutting, the goal with any kind of knife that you're using is stability and control. Let's start with your chef's knife. What you don't want to do is just grip your chef's knife by the handle or even hold most of the handle but put your pointer finger on top of the blade. This just isn't going to give you that control and stability that you need. Try holding it this way and then move your arm. You'll see that you break right at the wrist, which means that if you hold your knife this way, you're depending upon the strength of your wrist, and no one is out there bragging that they have super strong wrists. I dare you to find someone for me. Instead, what you should do is hold the actual blade. So, bear with me, put your thumb on one side of the blade and then put your forefinger on the other, careful not to touch the actual sharp edge, and wrap your fingers around the handle the rest of the way. So you have your thumb on one side, your forefinger on the other, and the blade is nestled, at least for me, between the crook of my forefinger. This is another reason why it's really important for the blade of your chef's knife to be wider than the handle. If your blade is the same width as the handle, you're not going to be able to get this kind of grip on it. Now, I know you might be looking at me and thinking, excuse me, are you crazy? I'm supposed to hold the blade? But I promise that this is the best way to get the most stability and control that you need. Again, try holding it this way and then move your arm. You'll see that your wrist actually can't break because the handle starts hitting against your forearm, which means that when you cut this way, the strength is coming from your shoulder and from your entire arm, which is going to give you that stability and control that you need. With this hold, you're going to be able to cut really, really sturdy things, which is exactly what your chef's knife is for. You do not want to have a flimsy hold on this knife. You want to have a really strong grip so that you can just cut right through things. And just in case you need a little more convincing, take a look at the knife itself. Ours has this little groove as the handle turns into the blade, and while it looks really nice, this isn't just for aesthetics. If you put your thumb on the blade and your forefinger on the other side, you can see that these grooves create a little cradle for them, and so they're just nestled really comfortably in these positions. And to me, this means that my knife should be held this way. Even my Santoku, which is much cheaper and older, has a little groove right there where I can put my thumb and my forefinger on the other side, and I can hold it pretty comfortably this way. So that's it for a chef's knife. For a paring knife, throw all those rules out the window. I usually hold mine by wrapping my fingers all the way around the blade with my thumb extended outward, or I put my pointer finger on top of the blade. A paring knife is a lot smaller, so you don't need such an intense grip on it, and you're also going to be cutting things that are a lot smaller and less sturdy than with your chef's knife, so you just don't need, again, quite that much of a grip on it. It's also kind of hard to hold your paring knife that way. I've tried to do it and I end up touching the actual blade of the knife, which is definitely not something that you want to do. The right hold for your serrated bread knife will depend on the shape of that knife. For a more traditionally shaped bread knife, which is long and thin and rectangular, I usually wrap my hand all the way around the handle with my thumb facing outward. For our bread knife, which is shaped a little bit closer to a chef's knife, I sometimes will put my hands directly on the blade, similar to my chef's knife hold, or I will wrap my fingers all the way around the handle again with my thumb facing outward. Your grip on your serrated knife also doesn't have to be quite so intense, because with a bread knife, you're usually cutting long, deliberate strokes rather than really small, quick ones like you do with your chef's knife. So because you're moving at a slower pace, you're usually fine just holding onto the handle. Now that you know how to hold your knives, you're ready to start chopping. Start with a cutting board. It can be wooden or plastic. It doesn't really matter too much unless you're handling raw meat, in which case you definitely want to use a plastic cutting board. If your board is sliding around a little bit, obviously that's not good. So take a paper towel, wet it, and then put it on your countertop and put the cutting board on top, and that'll give something for the cutting board to grip to, and it should stop moving around after that. The words we use for cutting instructions can vary a little bit. Sometimes we use them interchangeably, sometimes they're a little bit ambiguous, but these are the most common types of cutting instructions that you'll see in recipes. The first one that you'll probably recognize is to slice. This means to cut things into long, thin shapes. So for a bell pepper, for example, which I'm using for a Thai peanut slaw, you want to cut them into long, thin strips. For round foods like carrots or cucumbers, slicing means cutting them into a coin shape. Some recipes will specify the width that you're supposed to slice things in, and a lot of times you'll see directions to thinly slice something, and that means to just cut it as thinly as possible. I sliced some fennel up here for a pizza we're going to make later. I probably could have made it a little bit thinner, but just do your best. If your recipe doesn't specify how wide you're supposed to slice something, I usually go between 1/4 to 1/2 inch thick. But again, you don't have to get, super meticulous about this. You don't have to get out a ruler and make sure that you have it the right size. Just make sure that everything is sliced or chopped around the same size, just so that everything cooks around the same time and you're not ending up with some pieces that are raw and some pieces that are like disintegrated. This is not the Great British Baking Show. You do not have to be super, super perfect about everything. This is cooking. You can kind of fudge things a little bit more. You'll also see recipes call for julienning ingredients. This is similar to slicing, but it means cutting things into matchstick shapes. Carrots are one of the most common foods that you'll see recipes call for julienning. And so for something like this, I usually cut it in half, and then I start slicing it into thin strips, and then I turn those strips on their side, and I start slicing some more. And you basically just want to keep slicing until you create that matchstick shape, however large or small you'd like it. The next cut that you've probably heard of is dicing. This is also sometimes called chopping, and while there are some minute differences between dicing and chopping, they're basically the same thing. To dice, start by slicing your food and then turn it 90 degrees and start cutting again to create square shapes. Recipes will often specify the size of your chop. So some will say a small dice, or finely chop, or coarsely chop, or roughly chop, and these are all again denoting the size. So for a small dice, you usually just want to cut things as small as possible, usually between 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch thick. If it says to coarsely chop or to roughly chop, this just means that you don't need to be super precise about it. Just run your knife through it and create some really large squares. Some recipes will also call for cubing. This is pretty similar to chopping, but chopping usually applies to an onion where you're getting thin shapes, and cubing means you want an actual cube. A lot of times this will apply to things like a butternut squash. So I cube things by slicing one way first, laying that down, making longer slices to create really long rectangles, and then cutting those to create those cubes. Another common cut that you're likely to see is called mincing. This is often done with garlic, and if you haven't seen my garlic video, I'll link it up here. I talk a little bit about mincing there as well. Mincing means that you want to cut things into really, really small pieces. So as I said, this is often done with garlic, but it can also be done with shallots or herbs. To mince, start by chopping a little bit, just to kind of get yourself going, and then put your knife on the cutting board, put your other hand on top of the blade, and start to move your knife in a rocking motion along the food. I usually do this by starting from one side and rocking to the other side, and then moving things back into a pile and running my knife through it again, depending on how small I want to mince it. And this is exactly why your chef's knife has that curved blade, is to allow for this rocking motion. This rocking motion is also really helpful for other kinds of chopping. So for example, with nuts, it's just the easiest way to move your knife through it, even though you're never going to see a recipe say to mince nuts, at least not that I've ever seen. Usually they'll say finely chop or coarsely chop your nuts. And doing that rocking motion can just be an easy way to make that happen, because it's really hard to hold on to a whole pile of nuts. And so you don't want to try to do that and then potentially cut yourself. The last cut that I'm going to talk about is a Shifa Knot. This is often used for things like basil, and you're turning things into a ribbon shape. So if you try to just mince basil or finely chop it, basil is so delicate that you might end up just disintegrating that herb. So instead, a lot of recipes will call for Shifa Knotting it. To do this, take a bunch of leaves, stack them on top of each other, and then roll them into a little cigar shape. And I usually put the largest leaf on the bottom to help out with this, just to kind of hold everything in. And then run your knife in a slicing motion over the basil, as thick or as thin as you like it, or whatever your recipe calls for, and you'll have turned your basil into ribbons. When you cut things, there are two common motions that your knife will follow. You'll either lift your knife off the cutting board every single time after you make a cut, or you'll leave your knife on the cutting board and move it in a kind of rocking motion. If you're going to be lifting your knife off the cutting board, then you can keep moving your knife down along the food, as you can see with this green onion. If you're going to be moving your knife in a rocking motion, then you want to move the food towards the knife. I don't mean to get too complicated with this, just try it out, see what kind of motion works best for you. And again, remember, go slowly. I know you'll probably see a lot of chefs who move at lightning speed. You do not need to move that quickly in order to make good tasting food. You need to move slowly so that you can develop that muscle memory, so that you can get comfortable with what you're doing before you can speed it up. So take your time, go slowly, learn the rhythm, and then you'll be able to move faster. It's also important to think about how you're holding the food that you're cutting. I'll admit I'm not perfect at this, but the general rule is that you want to hold your hand in a kind of curved position as you're cutting. This is going to mean that if your knife gets a little bit too close to your hand, you don't have your fingertips extended so you're not going to graze those. Instead, your knife might hit a little bit closer to your knuckles, and that's just going to protect your hand overall. In general, though, you do want to make sure that your knife isn't getting too close to what you're cutting. Just always be aware of where your hands are and where that knife is. I always move my knife from right to left and just constantly having my blade chase my hand. It's also easiest if you use the middle of your blade to cut. This is going to give you the most stability and control, and also the cleanest cuts. If you hold your knife too far away and cut with the pointy edge, or if you move your hand too far forward and cut with the part that's really close to the handle, it's just going to be a really awkward hold, and you're not going to get as clean of a cut or movement with it. So that's a rapid fire overview of how to cut a bunch of different foods in a bunch of different ways. I'm going to be creating some super short videos with specific instructions on how to cut specific types of vegetables. If there's a particular vegetable or food that you've been struggling with, leave a comment down below, leave a comment on Instagram, DM me on Instagram, in some way notify me what it is, and I will make a video for you. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, give this video a thumbs up to support my channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell icon down below to be notified next time I post. And let me know what you'd like to see next time on Clockwork Kitchen. Happy chopping!